Welcome to the Thresholds of Reality, the podcast where we explore unexplained and mysterious events, phenomena, and legends. Today I'm joined by an archaeologist, Butch Mahaney. He's also an engineer, and he's done a lot of work building fantastic things and studying ancient mysteries. So strap in as we explore the edges of the unknown. Butch, thank you so much for joining us today and spreading some of that knowledge, some of that interesting ancient wisdom towards us. We've had a number of scientists, a couple of archaeologists. We had an Egyptologist come on and explain to us ancient Egyptian literature. And what we found out was that it's really not that much different than the stories we continue to tell today. What is the thing that got you into archaeology?
Well, thanks for having me on, Sam. I appreciate that. To be at the heart of it, really, watching Indiana Jones was like my first hook.
I knew it. I knew it.
Absolutely.
The hat.
Absolutely.
It was the hat.
Oh, yeah. I've got an Indiana Jones hat that has been all over the world, all my adventures. And I have all the gear. But what's nice about it is all is actually useful in the field. When I was doing field work in Peru, my professor was running things. He's like, I've never had somebody so prepared in the field. It's like, how do you fit what you need in that bag? I'm like, well, you live meagerly, you learn what things you need and what you don't. So, but that was my kind of first intro into archaeology. And then I lived in very rural East Tennessee. I grew up in the hills of the Appalachian Mountains, where we, had outhouses, no running water, drank from a spring, bathed in the creek, so it was very old. And then eventually moved up to Northern Virginia. And then my interest in history was piqued because a buddy of mine was mowing his yard, and a chest plate from the Revolutionary War shot out from under his lawnmower, right? What's this? I started looking, and that's when I realized that literally all the history was just inches below my feet. And I lived in Northern Virginia, right by near George Washington's estate. My backyard was actually the last place that I lived. My backyard was the first skirmish of the Civil War, even before the Battle of Manassas, which occurred 2 days later, which was actually the first engagement. So living there, I just got involved with all the history that was around us. I could go visit it. I went to the town of Dumfries, which was a larger harbor town than New York City was at one point, and got to just walk through all that history firsthand, and then worked on a site as a volunteer when I was still in high school of the Bronner Plantation, which was an old plantation. We discovered we were excavating the kitchen house. And we actually found a wall that was indicative of it being part of the Underground Railroad, because the way the construction was, it wasn't linked in together, it was butted up against. So it created this little space about 2 feet wide that you could hid people in. And once all that history just started, being at my fingertips, and you start touching things and whatnot, that really got me into it. And then I worked for a while for Alexandria Archaeology, and then got to one of the perks, because it's all volunteer work. Unfortunately, archaeology is not a rich man's sport. I guess you got to be a rich man to be able to get away with it, but you don't make a lot of money on it. But the big bonus was some Sundays I would work the actual museum that's in the torpedo factory in Old Town Alexandria. And the bonus was, they're like, you can open any drawer you want. You can handle any artifact you want. Just put it back where you got it from. Because some Sundays it would be rainy and it would be very slow. So you got to handle the artifacts. And then I actually didn't go to college until my 30s, because I was told at 23 that I'd be in a wheelchair by 30 and dead by 33. So I lived my 20s like I was never going to make it to my 30s. I woke up one day at 31, 32, and I wasn't in a wheelchair and I was still quite healthy. And I realized, oh man, I gotta figure something out. So ended up starting college about 33, 34. And so I went in with a more clear-minded kind of a direction. Well, I thought I did. So I got an associate's in electrical engineering. And if I don't have to integrate or differentiate again in my life, I won't. I was good at the math, but man, it was just grueling. And I took as an elective anthropology course in college, and realized I'd been studying anthropology my whole life. I just didn't know what to call it. So then I switched majors and I got a degree in anthropology with a focus on bioarchaeology because of my Indiana Jones dreams. Linguistics is interesting and all, but the artifacts and then the bones and the stories that the bones could tell really drew me in. And it led to me actually getting to live my Indiana Jones dreams in Peru. Actually toured the catacombs that the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark was kind of based on. Obviously, it wasn't as dramatic, like cinema-wise, but it was very dramatic as like experience-wise. So yeah, that's how I ended up in archaeology, anthropology, and I've been studying the strange and unknown pretty much all my life, because I grew up in a house that was haunted. The first house I ended up living in, and
Right.
There was a little library down the street, and this was in the hills of Tennessee where you rode your bicycle. And when I say street, I mean, gravel road.
Yeah.
It just goes up to the top of the mountain where there's a old church that was now a library, and just started digging into trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And that just led into, everything. I love to study the unknowable, I like to say, because a lot of this stuff you'll never have a solid, absolute yes or no on, because so much is interpreted and so much is built upon the work of previous people. So you just sort of have to, like with all things, you have to make certain assumptions that may or may not be accurate. So in some ways we'll never really know.
Yeah.
But the mystery is what draws me in.
Well, let me ask you, at what point, as you're digging down, does it cease to be American history and start to become archaeology? Like how far down? What's the distinction?
Well, it's based in colonial and pre-colonial or prehistoric per the guidelines of archaeology. So once the Europeans came, that becomes a colonial period, at least in the United States, and then you get down to a certain layer. Because what's wild is that most, from what I've seen and studied, people are all very similar, regardless of the time frames that you're looking at. And a good place for us to live now is typically the same good place it was for somebody else to live at before. So when we were studying colonial sites, particularly in Northern Virginia, you get to a certain layer of soil to where you quit running out of, manufactured pipe ends, because the pipe ends were the most common thing to find. And you get away from like the coins and the potteries and stuff, and then you start getting down into a different kind of pottery, and then you start getting to the stone shavings and the stone tools, and then that becomes the prehistoric. And I think there's more than enough evidence, particularly in the American Southwest, that then you dig down further, because then they get to a layer that they call the sterile layer. That's a layer of earth where you quit finding rock shards, you quit finding arrowheads, you quit finding axe heads, you quit finding fire pits, remnants of fire pits. And that the depth of that can vary greatly depending on the topography and geography of the area you're in. But you get down to a certain level and they're like, well, there's nothing else here, so we shouldn't dig any further. Other researchers have dug in further, because we've got the Clovis first mentality, that the Clovis people with the Clovis points were the first to inhabit the New World, or the Americas. Well, there's one researcher, and I'm blanking on his name right now. He dug down beyond that. It was a good 30, 40 feet below. And when you're talking 10 feet, you're talking tens of thousands of years. up to hundreds of thousands. So 30 feet below just seemed absolutely absurd. Well, he started finding stone chips and stone arrowheads, and hand worked stone. There's a real distinct way, and I learned this working at Alexandria Archaeology. You can look at two stones, and once you've learned to look at them, you can see distinct indicators that one was chipped away, napped, flint napping or stone napping, versus one that just smacked on another rock and broke into pieces. There's this little tiny bulge in the impact area. And after you've sorted thousands and thousands of bit of stone with these parameters, it gets to where you can really distinctly tell. So when an archaeologist looks and says, yes, this was napped, they're not just making an educated guess, there's evidence of it. So you can get down. So the history of the Americas, I think, goes back way further than the 12 to 15,000 years it's argued. I think it's usually around 12,000 years. And there's new evidence in white sands of footprints that have basically petrified in sand. And they were able to take grains from the footprints, carbon date those, and they came back with a solid, retestable 23,000 years, which puts people in White Sands National Forest 10,000 years, at least 10,000 years before the famous land bridge that modern archaeology accepts as to how people got into the Americas. So every time we start really digging, it goes back further and further and further.
Now, can I ask you something about just about the history, the time frame? So you say that there's this kind of blank zone. What time frame does that blank zone cover?
Well, it covers about, okay, so we know, it's accepted that 12,000 years ago, there were people in the Americas. And if the land bridge theory is true, or if you follow that, that means that would have been the first settlements, and then it would have been, 10,000 years to get down to the South America and such. So let's say we'll go with the 12,000. Then there's a window of about 20,000 years, 25,000 years with that 30 to 40 foot depth where there seems to be nothing, a big missing thing. And then they start discovering evidence of people being here. Now, they would have been primitive by modern standards, by what we can find, hunter-gatherers more than likely. So we've got somewhere between a 15 to 22,000 year window that at these particular sites, there seems to be no evidence of people.
Okay, so when was the last ice age? It ended roughly
about 12,000 years.
12,500. When did it start before that?
Oh,
when did it last?
Man, now you're digging in my homework here. I think it went on for at least 8,000 years.
8,000. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was like 8 to 12, something like that. And it's always these. And the thing is, with these, I always found it interesting that they're large jumps, because if somebody tells me something's going to cost me $800, and I say no, it's $1,200 now, that's a big jump. And archaeology and geology have those like, oh, it's 10 to 20,000 years. I'm like, well, that's half to double.
Yeah.
But a lot of that has to be averages based on the evidence gathered and where the evidence is gathered. Because you do an ice core, in one spot, and you do another ice core, 12 miles away. It's just the same as if you were to go visit, my backyard and another backyard 12 miles away. You could say that those are two different biomes entirely, but they still occur at the same time. So they're going to have different, markers for things. But yeah, so we've got a window of anywhere between 10 to 20,000 years in the very, 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 very few sites that have been dug. The probability of finding evidence of human occupation is actually very, very small. A lot of it is blind luck that leads to us actually finding an occupation.
Really?
Yeah. Like a lot of people assume, if we get buried, they assume that like, oh, it'll be easy to find evidence that our bodies existed, in 100 years. Actually, that's very unlikely. Most bones, most evidence of human occupation is gone within 100 to 200 years under the earth. So anytime that you find evidence, that's why it's so common to find, stone evidence, because stone endures. But to find the stick that the stone was mounted to, the leather that it was wrapped with, the bone that it was used to, chop meat off of, all of that stuff returns back to the earth. So finding anything is a rarity. That's why it's a lot of failed archaeological work. A lot of careers have been ruined because they're like, it's got to be right here. It's got to be right here. And maybe it was, but they missed it by 1.5 feet, because we are part of the earth, and our bodies are most of the things that we even use now. Like, most people think that if the world ended today, that, 1,000 years from now, there'd be plenty of evidence that we existed. There actually wouldn't be. Even all the big structures that we think are going to last forever, concrete breaks down pretty regularly.
Sure.
I mean, anybody that's walked on a sidewalk knows that it doesn't last very long. It was a new sidewalk just 5 years ago. Now it's got all these cracks and whatnot. So evidence is a very hard thing to locate.
Well, there's a principle that statisticians use known as the law of large numbers, which means that if you have a statistical improbability, something that's very unlikely, and yet you find it, it means that your assumptions of it are that it's not as rare as you thought. So if the evidence is hard to find, but we're finding it, it means that there's a lot more evidence out there.
Absolutely.
Right? So humanity was probably a lot more widespread than we thought, because if we're just digging in any old place and getting lucky, then there's a lot of evidence out there.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the evidence is just dismissed because it's too wild to even contemplate. Like some of these large, structures that are mountain-sized structures that have a real resemblance to something that was intentional, like carved faces, the old man in the mountain. There's these sites that are just like, man, it's just too big. It's just too astronomical. So it's just dismissed, and no real work gets done to it. There's plenty of sites like that they're like, there's one in the Philippines that there's this wall, and it clearly, in my eye, shows, it was laid out. There's another one we were talking earlier in Montana that I want to go check out. Huge monolithic stones, and it gets dismissed as, well, number one is it's too big, and it very well could be just a normal geological thing, so it's not worth investigating. Well, so much of that gets dismissed that I think really deserves more research, because it shows the hallmarks of being engineered. It has clear lines. It has offset stacking, just like we do bricks now. You have a huge monolithic stone, and then there's another one set, halfway off the edge, and another one meeting that one in the middle to create that standard brickwork look that we're looking at, that we're used to when it's small bricks. But if it was a brick the size of your house or the size of two of your houses, people are like, unbelievable, can't be.
Yeah. What's that place called?
In Montana, I meant to look it up while we were talking about it. I think it's King's something site. Let's see. Actually, I think if we just Google monolithic in Montana, because it runs up into the Yukon territory. There's other sites that were found there.
Something like this.
Let's see here. Similar. Sage Wall. That's it. Sage Wall, Montana, megaliths. Sage Wall is the name of the place.
Sage Wall.
That's down in the lower left corner there. Natural or man-made? And you tell me that's.
Oh shoot.
That's natural.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's it. Sage Wall, Montana, because that site is also on private property. Luckily, from what I've heard and watched and read, you can actually make arrangements with the owners. They got no problems, but they want to know that you're there before you just go visit. Yeah. And this is just a small sample. This wall actually runs There's another wall about, I don't know, 10 yards facing it, and they run parallel to each other for at least a quarter mile. And it, kind of weaves along the terrain just a little bit. Yeah, here you go. You can kind of see with this fella, it's over on the right-hand side. There is another wall that runs right along with it.
Yeah.
And there, nobody will fund work for it because it's just considered a natural thing. But I would love to go up there. I want to go up there. I like to do some off-roading with my Jeep. We'll go up there with my son with the metal detector and some 3D scanners and whatnot, because I think a lot of what I'd like to do is take scans of the stuff so you can kind of get an idea of the topography of it and come back and look at it again in a 3D rendered environment. Because my last job led me to learn a lot about 3D rendering and building stuff in 3D, because once you get a scan of it, then you could basically revisit it as many times as you wanted in a virtual environment. I think some oh gosh, I blanked on words. The way they've been scanning the Amazon
LiDAR.
The LiDAR. I think a LiDAR run of that area, Sage Mountain, would reveal a lot. I think a LiDAR would be a lot. And what's nice is that LiDAR is getting a lot less expensive with drone technology. And, just as technology evolves, they get smaller and lighter. I think it'd be really interesting to have there, do some LiDAR scans of that. And there are other spots, like I said, if you just go north and west of there along the coast, you find a lot of stuff in Canada, Yukon territory. And the Yukon territory is very sparsely populated. Heck, Montana's very sparsely populated. So it's a matter of like all this property that's owned or even federally owned, a lot of which you're not allowed to go on. No, a lot of these places, there has not been a modern human walk through those places at all. And it could be so overgrown. I mean, the pyramids in Mexico City and Tiwanaku and all that. If you look at original photos of that stuff, it was a dirt hill.
Right.
If you didn't know better, you'd climb right over it and not even know.
That's true. In Oaxaca, there's hills all over the place, and they're all pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
And they just need someone to go in and excavate them. But they think that there's something like thousands of pyramids in Oaxaca that have all been overgrown.
Yeah.
Just from time.
Well, while I was in Peru, we actually part of the skeleton we got were part of a Huaca, which was, the mud brick pyramids. And it was actually right on the edge of a farmer's property. So the property, as far as they could dig into it, to the fence line, it became flat and actually became a road where they had a lot of underground piping. But they were able to dig right up to it. Just beyond the fence, it looked like just a trash pile for trash burning. But that's because of where the guy burned his trash. And then once you learn and you get an eye for it, as you're driving through the desert of Peru, you could just look over and be like, that's a Huaca, that's a hill, that's a hill, that's a Huaca. And in that Huaca, there are artifacts. There are at least skeletons and skeletal remains, which you can tell a whole lot from that. So yeah, I believe there's plenty of sites like all over the place that just and a lot of them honestly just get leveled. There's Peru is going through a lot of, and they have been for decades, rise up against the government. And I know of particular sites that were just bulldozed over because the person in power got stroked a check, and it was more financially beneficial for that to become whatever site, whatever factory, whatever thing they needed to build than it was as an archaeological site. And I think it happens a lot.
So you did some work in your graduate studies regarding the Star Child skull.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about what the Star Child skull is and how you came to be involved in studying it.
Okay, so the Star Child skull is an anomalous skull. And I first heard about it on, the many mysteries of the unknown or the unexplained, all that kind of stuff that, I always find very interesting. And since my work was in bioarchaeology, which is the study of osteology, the study of bones, we were always looking for pathological conditions in bones, learning to identify different pathological conditions, and so it was very bone centered. And since I was always interested in the Star Child skull, that's what led me to convince my professor that that's I wanted to write my final on that. And he was very much, yeah, there it is. After I wrote my paper, which, of course, I got high marks on, he was like, well, if I had you do it again, I'd ask you to do something more scientific. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Just because it was called, and I specifically in my paper referred to it as a Young skull, because Melanie Young is a person who's in possession of it. Okay. And the name Star Child skull was what made a lot of people avoid associating their reputation and their name with it. So a little backstory on the Star Child skull, so that our viewers and listeners can, get an understanding of it. So the Star Child skull, according to unverifiable history of it, sometime in the 1930s, a young girl was in Mexico, by Copper Canyon, Mexico, with her family visiting relatives there. They were Americans. I believe they lived in Texas. And when they went there, there was an area of the canyon that they're like, no, we're not allowed to go there. That's just off limits. And the locals never went there. Well, this young girl decided to go exploring there. And while she was out exploring, she came upon a cave. When she went into the cave, there was a skeleton there. And then a little arm, a skeletal arm, was sticking out of the dirt. Supposedly holding the hand of the normal skeleton. So the little girl dug it up and found this anomalous skeleton, anomalous skull. It looked just different to her than the other one that was right beside it. So she, according to the story, bagged up all the bones in her apron or whatever she had to wrap them up with, and was going to take them back with her. Well, along the way, she realized that she was going to get in trouble because she went to the very spot that they said not to go. So she put them in the nook of a tree by the river that she was going to come back for on her last day and just take them with her. Well, during their stay, a storm came through and washed the skeletons away. She was lucky enough, after the storm settled, because it would be Copper Canyon, it's in Mexico, dry land doesn't really absorb water, so a flash flood could happen at just about any time. So she was able to recover the normal skull and the Star Child skull, along with part of a mandible, which is your jaw, your lower jaw, and the maxilla, which is part of your upper jaw that hold teeth. Now, then she took the two back with her to Texas, and they sat in a barn forever. They got lacquered because at the time it was not uncommon to collect skeletons or skulls from ancient America, Native America, Mexico, and such. So they got lacquered, and then in the 90s it was handed over because apparently the girl who collected them was an old lady. She was didn't want this to get just lost in her barn. Handed it over to Melanie Young. Melanie Young had it for a few years, and then eventually took it to this fella named Lloyd Pye. Now, a little bit about what makes the Star Child skull so anomalous. At first glance, it's the shape of the thing. It has kind of like bulging areas of where the frontal lobe of your brain would be. And it has a line down the center of the skull. So it kind of bubbles out. So it looks just kind of big. To associate with what's a common recognizable thing nowadays is the alien gray. It kind of has an alien gray kind of shape to it. It's not quite so overwhelmingly huge as it can be portrayed in a lot of different shows and movies, but it definitely shows some weirdness to it. Another one of the very easy things to notice is that the placement of the eyes seems to be close together relative to a normal skull. And the girl and Melanie Young ended up with both the skull that was found with it and it. So there's a real easy comparison there to look at. Once you get a little deeper into the anomalies of the skull, there's slots in the back of your eye sockets where your optic nerve and everything goes through. Well, they have a distinct pattern. That pattern is very different on the Star Child skull. Also, another thing is the Star Child skull does not have sinuses. And we all, have had a sinus headache here or there. So we know we have sinuses. Sinuses are just openings, large cavities in the skull features that allow basically our mucous membranes and everything to kind of stabilize.
It's like the size of a fist.
About the size of a fist, right between your eyes, behind your nose, right in the back, right? Well, the Star Child skull does not have that. Also, the hole where your spinal cord, the foramen magnum, goes up into your skull, and that's where your spine mounts up. That's where your spinal cord goes. On the Star Child skull, it is shifted more to the front than a normal skull would be, which is kind of weird because of the way you can use the location of the foramen magnum to determine if something walked on all fours or walked upright, because it has to be balanced with the shape of the head to be upright. If it's on all fours, it just hangs kind of, off the back. So that is, more toward the front than a normal skull would be. Also, the external acoustic meatus, which are the ear holes, are about twice the size and lower into the front than normal average human acoustic meatus are. And these are just some of the features. Also, the forehead is very rounded. It doesn't really have a brow ridge at all. The back of the skull is I don't want to say flattened, because that's not really the right word, because a lot of people thought it was shaped that way because of cradle boarding. And that's a method of securing children when they're young and their skull and their bones are still soft. And you tie them down to a board so you can work with them in the field or what have you, and they're restrained. But on the Star Child skull, it's not flattened. That's just kind of the shape of it. And the way you can tell is on one that's been cradle boarded, it loses all. If you feel your skull at this point, anybody can rub the back of their head. You can feel there's like little bumps and ridges. It's not particularly round. It's not particularly flat. When you cradle board a child, that becomes very flat and you lose all that topography that is there. On the Star Child skull, it has all that natural topography. Okay. So that means it wasn't cradle boarded. And in, South America, particularly, cradle boarding and shaping of the skull were used to show, wealth or wisdom. It was some symbolic thing. And you can do that by, using various methods to squeeze the skull with ropes and cords or boards on top of it to shape the skull to get a unique shape to the skull. Now, the initial ideas were when Lloyd Pye was into the UFO community. He was a fairly big figure in the UFO community. And Melanie Young took the skull to him at a UFO convention, probably in Nevada somewhere near Area 51. So I've never been to one, but I'd love to be at one. I think it would be very interesting. But that, handing it off to him, his very first thing was like, oh my God, I've got the skull of an alien in my hands. And not to devalue the work he did, but he did all of his work based on that presupposition. He was like absolutely sure this was either an alien or an alien hybrid. And when I wrote my paper, I did not argue that it was alien or alien hybrid. The point I wanted to make in my paper was that this is a highly anomalous skull. Okay, I went through and dug through all kinds of different literature, looking at all kinds of different medical conditions that would have caused all the identifiable abnormalities. Because we only have the calvarium, which is most of the skull, like without the mandible. It's missing, a lot of the facial bones. Only had part of the maxilla, the occipital bones missing. So it's really the bulk of what we call a skull. So there's a lot of things missing to make absolute diagnosis in a lot of different things. But Lloyd Pye's work was to prove the conclusion he had already come to, which is not a good way to approach science. You know, if you're going to approach something, you want to just go where the evidence leads. Don't look for the evidence to lead you somewhere. So in my research, I was looking, and hydrocephaly was the most common thing to identify why this head is so much larger than a normal head. Another important factor is that based on the dentition, which are the teeth and how they're erupted and which ones are out, you can really identify the age pretty closely. Teeth are the most genetically driven thing in human development. Your bones can be changed by some pressure. Your flesh can be changed by pressures, modifications, but your teeth overall are going to grow the way that the DNA tells them to grow. So we're able to identify, or was it identified, that this was a skull of a 4 to 5 year old child based on the teeth that had erupted, of the mandible we had, of the maxilla that was had. I say we, but I only say we in reference to research. I've never gotten to handle the thing. I will. It's on my bucket list. So we are at, the evidence did point that it was a 4 to 5 year old child when it died. Now, an anomaly with that too was the amount of wear on the teeth. You can tell a lot by how flat teeth are based on anything like if you were to chew on sandpaper all day, it would make your teeth pretty darn flat. Older people, once you get to a certain age with teeth, because all your teeth will be in, you can start to determine that can be a factor in determining how old an individual is. Based on the wear of the teeth. Now, the wear on the teeth that we had, or that are had, of the Star Child skull, show an excessive amount of wear. So either, and this was part of the argument that Lloyd Pye put forth, is like the wear on the dentition indicates a longer life than 4 to 5 years. That could be argued, but that's not an absolute. This kid could have just been living in the desert. And my field work, I learned, sand is like salt in the desert. It's in everything that you eat. It doesn't matter.
Gets in between your toes and everything.
Oh yeah. You learn to make your bed right as soon as you get out of it. Otherwise, you're just going to be crawling into a pile of sand. If you're lucky enough to have a bed. So it's possible that this individual could have just consumed a lot of hard, grit-filled breads and materials. Okay, So you got this 4 or 5 year old individual that passed away, and then they have the skull of it was able to be determined an adult female, probably in her 30s, that died of blunt force trauma, which is a blow to the head, and we don't know what killed the Star Child. So with the comparisons, the skull is definitely more bulbous. And hydrocephaly was the #1 claim, because right away, it's hydrocephaly. Now, hydrocephaly is a condition that affects children mostly, can affect adults by viral infections. Usually in adults, you have to open up the brain or the skull to allow the pressures out. Children, there's procedures now that have come in the last 60 or 70 years that have allowed people to drain the spinal fluids that are supposed to flow that don't. Now, in young children, the bone hasn't become solid yet. So it expands, it balloons out because of the pressure. Now, usually that's an irregular ballooning. It's very irregular, like pressure on one side is a little different than the other, but it's a swelling all over. The Star Child skull does not illustrate that. It does show ballooning, but it is uniform between these two lobes. And furthermore, if it were hydrocephaly, the sagittal suture, which is a line that runs down the middle top of your skull that allows for growth plate, that would also balloon. But in the Star Child skull, it does not balloon out. Now, if there was premature fusion of that could explain it, but the CT scans of the Star Child skull show that there is no premature fusion. The fusion or bonding of the two pieces that go along this crack, the suture, are where they would expect them to be at a 5 to 6 year old. So if it was hydrocephaly, it would have ballooned out all over regularly and would have definitely ballooned on the sagittal suture. So from a diagnostic standpoint, it was not cradle boarding. It was not, deformation of the skull through, mechanical methods. It couldn't be hydrocephaly. So now we're kind of left with, what else could it be? Those are the most common ones. And a lot of doctors argued that, it had to be because there couldn't be anything else. And a lot of the work that countered the work of Lloyd Pye, who funded a research group, the Star Child Project, to try to find answers, would just dismiss it as hydrocephaly and leave it alone at that. Well, it wasn't hydrocephaly. Honestly, the evidence shows, and it shows now, there was more research done in 2017, that it was just the way that this individual's DNA said to grow the skull. Okay, the volume is a bit higher than normal, by about 20 to 40 cc's, which it would not occur with cranial deformation. When you deform a skull through pressures, its volume stays the same. It just changes where those volumes are. So it was naturally had a larger brain cavity. All of the typical topography within the inside of the brain is all normal for what you'd expect. It's just there's more brain cavity there. Now, Lloyd Pye did a lot of good work. He did DNA work at the time in the 90s. There wasn't as much DNA. I mean, honestly, the human genome only got sequenced in the late 90s. I think it was like 98, 99, something like that. So we had just really started being able to break down DNA at that time. So he was able to do enough work. There was enough research, there was enough information available to say that the Star Child skull had a human mother. But the Y DNA from the male was not extractable. It's more harder to preserve DNA. Mm-hmm. Now, carbon-14 dating showed, and it's still been agreed upon, that this is a 900-year-old skull. Okay, so we're talking a child, 5 to 6 years old, lived in Mexico 900 years ago with these anomalies. Now, the closeness of the eyes. Another thing about the eye sockets is they're very, very shallow. Okay, I think 1.4 or 1.5 centimeters, which is, I mean, usually ones, the human eye is like 3 to 4 centimeters. So half, if not less, as deep as the human eye.
Would that make his eyes bulge out, or would they still be kind of shallow?
No, more than likely they'd bulge out.
Okay.
And once again, we have to make assumptions that the eyes are about the same diameter as our eyes. So his eyes would definitely bulge out. He would definitely have a very narrow face. His nose was more than likely going to be a very small nose. So it really starts to fall into the shape of it. There's been, forensic artists that have recreated his face, several different versions by different artists. And they all have that, like if you were to guess an alien human hybrid, in most people's minds, at least in America and most of the Western world, because our idea of aliens are pretty well set at this point. You got the alien grays. Of course, there's the lizard, and there's all kinds of other ones, but the grays are most common. If you were to think of an alien human hybrid, this is what it would look like. Absolutely, this is what it would look like if it fit our modern conceptions of these things. Honestly, even stone, petroglyphs that seem to illustrate aliens also tend to be grays. So this created a whole lot of excitement in the alien community. I mean, it got me excited enough to write my whole paper on it, and to have to argue it among a lot of people that are like, this is crazy stuff. But there's enough anomalous things in it that this child, to live to 5 or 6 years old, 900 years ago, if all the anomalies, because there was a list, I had about 12 or 13 different possible pathological conditions that could identify a lot of the anomalies. I wasn't able to identify all of them, but a lot of them. But if this individual had 4 of these things, and a lot of times one of them, the lifespan is a few weeks, even in modern times, it would have been an absolute miracle for this child to live to be 5 or 6 years old and learn and be able to consume enough hard food to wear his teeth down to this level. You know, he or she, whatever it is, at that age, you can't really tell. So it says a lot of things about the society that this child grew up in. Now, as much as I would love to say that this is the skull of an alien human hybrid, I don't think it is. There was new work done. The Star Child project dissolved under this new work. Let me see if I can remember the name of it, which was a brilliant article, but they actually did, and I shot the article off to my professor that was very much like, oh, you're something more scientific. And it's like, somebody finally did it. They actually stepped up to the page, and it's the field reports. And you can look it up, field reports, Star Child skull. Here we go. Final results. And this was in like 2017, 2018. And with next gen DNA analysis, they were able to determine that it was definitely, the mother was human and the father was definitely human as well. Okay. And some people still want to believe, and I mean, with every research, you can, if you're looking to find holes in something, you can probably make something up to make it maybe. But everything I've read, it's pretty solid. They still haven't quite explained all the anomalies in it. Some of the anomalies that Lloyd Pye and his research found, they've not been able to find again. Like they stated, there were red fibers in the bone matrix, and nobody else has been able to find red fibers in the bone matrix. There was also supposed to be, because your bone is made up of a laminar and trabecular bone. So the laminar is the smooth stuff we see on the outside. The trabecular is the more, it almost looks like a sponge.
Sponge,
but
yeah.
Of course, it's not. It's spongy in the middle. And within that bone matrix, they were saying there was little red deposits of stuff that we don't know what it was. They weren't able to find that either. Okay, but even the researchers on that said, look, we can't explain all the anomalies on this thing. Because they can sequence it enough to tell the chromosomal sources. I think one's haplogroup Q and one's haplogroup C1, so they can kind of tell the region that the mother and father came from. But they can't break it down to see if this thing had like Down syndrome, which could explain the location of the eyes, or any number of other genetic conditions that would kind of explain it.
Or incest, right? Could be the product of incest.
Absolutely, it could be. Now, considering they're from separate haplogroups, that's probably not the case.
Oh, okay.
But it could be. Now, this is where it gets real interesting, though. At this point in time, it is accepted that there are at least 3 more skulls that look like the Star Child skull. At least 3 more. Now,
in the same region?
3 are, well, there's some in Mexico and good old Peru, which has yielded some of the most amazing skulls ever. There's at least 1 in Peru, in western Peru, in the desert region of Peru. And I've actually, I saw that one. I stumbled upon that one because I like watching videos of osteology museums in Peru and whatnot, just because, I mean, the skeletons they have and the skulls they have are just mind-blowing. I swear some of them definitely have more than normal volume. No doubt about it. They're crazy. But as they're panning through, these are skull collections, bam, right there. And that shelves was another Star Child skull. There's at least 3 in Mexico. This one farmer in the Same general area of Mexico as I would reference the American Southwest as being a same general area. I mean, that covers several states. But in the same general Copper Canyon area, there's a farmer that found 3 of them. And at the time I was doing my research, 15 years ago. Yeah, actually, God, it was longer than that ago. Oh, never mind. I don't remember that part. But so when I was doing my research at the time, he was wanting to, charge a ridiculous amount of money to get people to come check him out, to allow them, which is understandable. If you're a broke farmer, yeah, absolutely. You're going to do what you can to get money. So I don't condemn the guy. But now science has recognized that there's at least 3 more. And now my argument is, okay, this isn't one weird anomaly. We have an entire species, Gigantopithecus. You've ever heard of Gigantopithecus, Sam?
Yes.
The Bigfoot.
Right.
The predecessor, it would have fit the idea of Bigfoot in our modern world. Definitely is a hominid species in the Americas, I think, 70, 80,000 years ago, 90,000 years ago, something like that, big number. That entire species has been named, given a genus, the whole routine, from a portion of a mandible and a small portion of a skull. And they're like, absolutely, it existed. Gigantopithecus was real. It was a 8 to 10 foot, hominid, walked on 2 feet, all this from 2 bone fragments. Now we have the Star Child skull, the first one, and absolutely 3 more, and possibly an unidentified 4th one. So now we have 5 skulls that match this same look, the same topography, the same bone structure, the same shape of the skull. And science is still yet to recognize it as a possible additional species of human, although it's still human, or subspecies, because technically Homo sapiens sapien is a subspecies of Homo sapien, but it needs to be categorized or at least researched to see if this really was a different group of humans. Because once you have 5 skulls, you've got the evidence there. Now it's getting the funding. That's always the thing.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. It reminds me of this kind of the reverse process that was done with some dinosaurs, where there was phenotypical differences between subcategories of species, and then somebody posited the idea, well, maybe they're just changing shape as they get older. Maybe the horns are growing in as they get older. Maybe it's not a separate species at all. Maybe these are all triceratops and the horns are just growing in as they get older.
Absolutely. And I think that very well could be the case, because honestly, at this point, and maybe it's a developmental stage of humans that, we've out-evolved, and then there was a drop back because of some chromosomal crossover that, like, oh, wait, now there was a time when humans were like this, and then they developed into more, just like you're saying, that maybe if this child had grown up to be 20 or 30 years old, we wouldn't have even noticed the difference. But I agree with you completely, because quite honestly, if we applied the standards of all the different species of humans, hominids, that are currently categorized, and a lot of it is ego, man. A lot of it is this guy found a skull that was weird enough, and I won't condemn everybody on it, but come on, we all have egos, and they want their name on something. They spent their life out sweating their butts off, digging, and finally find a skull that's just different enough. Now, truth is, if we were to apply those same standards to modern skulls, you measure my skull from a guy from sub-Saharan Africa, skull from a guy from Northwest Asia particularly, there would be enough differences for someone to claim that we all 3 were different species of hominid. So once you start applying the standards that are in anthropology now about, like, oh, this group, that group, this group, that group, And it is pretty crazy once you start looking at the big list of them. I can't even remember all the names of them now. And there's even more now than when I was in college. And man, it was a tough time remembering them all then. But if you apply that same standard, it'd be like, okay, there is just a variety of human variants based on location. I think it would narrow down and show that maybe we aren't, because it's claimed now that 20,000 years ago, where there were at least 6 different hominids existing. There was, the Neanderthals, several in Asia, the little hobbit guys, all kinds of different ones. And now somehow Homo sapiens sapiens became the dominant species of the world. Well, maybe it wasn't exactly that. Maybe it was just regional differences that we still have today. Maybe we're not all so darn different. Maybe we all are part Neanderthal and all part Homo sapien and all part something else. I mean, there's some evidence showing right now that, because out of Africa has been the accepted idea of how humans evolved. From Australopithecus, Africanus, and then they eventually got out, and the tool makers, and they went out among the world, and then there shows that there was a bit of a collapse, and they went back into Africa and then came back out of Africa. Well, now there's new evidence starting to show that it's almost a seeding rather than just all out of Africa. That there were groups that started in Asia, there were groups that started in Europe, there were groups of a Homo sapien type or predecessors to Homo sapiens throughout the world in different spots. And quite honestly, our conclusion that it all came out of Africa is merely because of a geological coincidence that fissured the earth at that particular spot, the cradle of humanity, that allowed the ground to crack in a way that gave us access to a hillside that we're able to dig through millions of years of layer from the side. And that's where all these early hominids, the ones that, were just starting to be human-like, they still had the hand, feet, but they were starting to work upright. The thumb shifted a little bit. All of that evidence comes from there because of a true lucky break in the Earth's crust. So because that's where the evidence comes from. And it's not I don't say this to condemn the people that came to those conclusions, because that's all the evidence that, is available or was available. But that's all it comes from. It's a lucky break in the crust that said, here it was. If that same break had maybe occurred in North America, we may have, or South America, or Russia, or Australia, it might be an entirely different theory that everybody came out of that one source.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot more evidence surfacing now that shows that humanity was quite widespread, and perhaps they even networked from distant locations. And
Yes.
you mentioned one of my favorite archaeological mysteries during our green room discussion, which was the Younger Dryas. And there's not enough time in a day to put that all in one podcast, but a lot of mysteries coming out of the Younger Dryas and the end of the last ice age.
Yeah, well, it's also the Younger Dryas is answering a lot of questions, and it does it almost too beautifully. Like the world flood myth, which isn't a myth. I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that a world flood occurred. Yeah, I mean, it's just now with Google Earth, look at the Sahara, particularly we won't touch
the
on
Eye of Africa.
Boom, the Rakat structure. Yeah, you look at that from satellite imagery, and you tell me you don't see water just washing from the Mediterranean.
We did a whole episode on it.
Yeah, what's that?
We did a whole episode on it.
Oh yeah, I that one. Oh, and it's so new that it's just mind blowing, the data that's coming out of that. Yeah. And then the fact that I think can be easily shown that the Mediterranean Sea was once a very fertile valley, and all it would have taken, is that one crack right there at the strait where it comes
Gibraltar.
in, the Strait of Gibraltar, the ocean deluge coming in would have wiped out everybody that would have been living there. It would also caused a big wave that would have come up and then come through and washed across Africa to create a lot of the topography you see there. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing, man. I could talk about all this stuff for hours, man. I do too. I go to the bar, man, and there's this one corner of my bar that they're like, all right, let's belly up for some history. Let's see what crazy things we can talk about today.
I love it. Well, we'll have to have you come back and chat some more about the Younger Dryas and some more of your searches. Now, let me ask you this: what are your current projects? What are some things that you're working on right now?
Right now, I'm working on just more engineering kind of projects. My archaeology.
Tell me about.
Go ahead.
Tell me about those projects and where can people find you?
Well, actually, I do have a website that's in development. Well, it's not in development; it's up there. I do need to modify it to catch it up. Butchbuilds.com, and I just started a website or a YouTube channel, Butch's Bench. And on there, I only have one video where I installed a amp and speakers in a Defender 90. Anybody that Fast and Furious would appreciate that truck because it was used in that a lot. But you can also reach me at butchbuilds.com. Yeah, I had a designer. She did a wonderful job at this thing, but as far as functionality, it's kind of lacking. These are some of the engineering projects that I've done. Those are featured in a few museums here in the Tulsa area. I've helped people develop patent ideas. That one in the middle there, it looks like a drawing. It's a cheater putter this guy wanted. I thought he knew how to play golf. He's like, I don't even play golf, but it'd be great. What's that?
It's got like a spring inside.
Actually, it has motors. Like so that, yeah. Well, what it is that what looks like a piston, that's actually just to drive the force of the front face of it. Because what it is a putter that you line up, right? You get it set right where you need it. You push a button, and then on your backswing, no matter how much you jack up your backswing and you change your angle, the face of the club will strike at that point and that ball at exactly how you lined it up.
Oh, it's like a chicken head.
Yeah, it's exactly. And it's a cheater putter. It's totally, you're always going to putt exactly the way you lined up, no matter how bad your backstroke is. And that's what I like to do. I like to help people develop crazy ideas, wild ideas. I've done art pieces, museum pieces, just engineering fun stuff. I always thought that I would be, with my studies, that I would work in preserving artifacts and history, and ended up in a museum building wild stuff. But I do still get to go twice a year, make whiskey at George Washington's estate. Which is a fun thing to make whiskey like it was in 1799. So yeah, if you want to hit me up or something, Butch at butchbuilds.com, I'll be able to get to you. This is all in development. I usually like to go hands-on and build stuff beforehand. Everybody keeps telling me I need those little Twitter and all that stuff, but I'd rather be in the garage doing stuff than looking around on the computer, which is something I'm working on. So,
well, I love it.
Thank you so much for having me. Any other time, any other topic, like I said, I could sit and talk about this for hours, Sam. I do. You should really see me getting animated when I'm talking about it over a pint or two.
Sounds great, man. We'll have you back on. We really appreciate you and appreciate everybody coming in. I do want to bring up this comment. Tyler says, I think we live in a computer program and our bodies are used to power AI robots. It's the only explanation for how weird the world is. Well, I don't think it's the only explanation, but
not at all. Thanks, we know far less than there's more that we don't know than we do know.
Agreed. Thank you again to everybody in the chat for joining us today. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you more of this spectacular content, especially when Butch comes back to talk to us more about the Younger Dryas and all the stuff, all his bar talk.
Thank you so much.
Until next time, keep on exploring the edges of the unknown.